Good evening, everybody, and welcome to what we are now going to be calling Mad Street Madness, a virtual event brought to you by Madison Street Books. I have our guests this evening to thank for helping me make my way through Mad Street Madness. Tonight, we're fortunate enough to have Margot Livesey and Claire Lombardo in conversation to discuss The Boy in the Field, Margot's latest novel. Margot is an author of actually 9 novels. This is her most recent, but she's written 8 others. She's an author of a nonfiction book called The Hidden Machinery, Essays in Writing. She is a professor at the Iowa Workshop, the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is where she and Claire met, where they encountered each other because Margot was Claire's professor when she was writing The Most Fun We Ever Had. And as you all may or may not recall, we were fortunate enough to have Claire with us back in February here in conversation with Kylie Reed. And now Claire is going to be taking us through the paces, taking Margot through the paces on her book. One of the most interesting things about this book is not just the bloody boy in the field, but all the things that happened to the people after they encountered the boy in the field. So I think that we are going to leave it to Margot and Claire to take us down that road, but not all the way, because we don't want to fully be spoiled. But it's a fascinating story, a really intriguing story, and I'm hoping that they're going to discuss a little bit about the structure of a novel like this when you have 3 or 4 protagonists and how that all interweaves and how you work around all of that when you've got a couple of different significant characters. So anyway, I leave the evening to Margot and Claire. I'll circle back to say goodnight to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and take it away, ladies.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for making us so welcome at Madison Street Books. It's a privilege to be here and a special thrill to talk to the wonderful Claire. I feel so lucky to be among her early readers. So thank you, Claire, for being here tonight.
Thank you, Margot. It's such an honor, and it's really nice to see your face. It's been a really long time. And I'm so excited to talk about this book also. So yeah, great to be here.
I thought I would begin by just reading the opening couple of pages the way into our conversation, and then we could talk about whatever we want, including trying to answer Mary's wonderful questions. And this is the opening of the novel, and I should say that it is set in the countryside near Oxford in England. And as you will see, it is set in the last century. The field. Here is what happened one Monday in the month of September in the last year of the last century. Matthew, Zoe, and Duncan Lang were on their way home from school. Usually they took the bus from the larger town where they attended secondary school to the smaller town where they lived. But that morning their father had said he had an errand to run and would collect them. So they waited beside the school gates and watched the bus depart. After 15 minutes, with no sign of the familiar car, they began to walk along the road that led to their town. They each wore a version of the school uniform, a white shirt, black trousers, and a black pullover. Expecting their father to appear at any moment, they walked fast, making it a game to see how far they could get before he pulled up beside them. They left the last houses behind. Hawthorn hedges and an occasional ash tree hid the fields that bordered the road. Through one gate, they saw a herd of cows, through another, rows of barley. The afternoon was warm and still. Only a few leaves fringed with brown hinted at autumn. Zoe was the one who spotted something through the hedge. She had a gift for finding things: birds' nests, their mother's calculator, a missing book, a secret. "What's that?" she demanded, stooping to peer through the tangled branches. The flash of red could have been poppies bordering the field, but the poppies had already lost their petals. Before her brothers could answer, she turned and ran back to the gate they had just passed. Matthew and Duncan watched her go. Zoe brought her knees high and pumped her arms. Last sports day, she had won the quarter-mile by almost 3 seconds. As she reached the gate, Duncan, without a word, took off after her. A car sped by, the smooth engine noise undercut by a harsh rattle. Matthew looked at the sky, mostly blue with a fortress of cumulus clouds in the east, and gave up on being the responsible one who waited for their father. The 2 bags, his and Zoe's, banged against the metal bars of the gate as he climbed over and jumped down onto the rutted ground. The field had recently been harvested, and circular bales of straw lay randomly across the dull gold stubble. In the middle of the field stood a magnificent oak tree in full leaf. Matthew caught up with first Duncan, then Zoe. From a distance, it was still possible to believe that the boy was asleep, lying on the grassy border between hedge and stubble. "Christ," whispered Zoe. The closer they got to him, the slower they walked. None of them spoke. Glinting bluebottles and smaller flies circled the boy. His hair was dark, his skin very pale. He wore a deep blue shirt, a color Duncan would later call cobalt, black shorts, and what appeared to be long red socks. At the local private school, the younger boys wore bright red knee socks, and for the briefest instant, Zoe thought, "Oh, he's in uniform." A few steps closer, and she grasped the nature of the red. His eyelids were pale with a delicate tracery of veins. Everything that happened, they all 3 agreed later, was only possible because of those closed eyelids. The boy's chest rose fractionally and fell fractionally. With no one to tell them what to feel, they did not cry out or exclaim. Zoe tiptoed forward, knelt down at a cautious distance, and leaned over to touch his arm, where it emerged below his shirt sleeve. His skin was reassuringly warm. He was a little older than her, perhaps 18, perhaps 19. "We need to get help," she said.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I feel like this is such a compelling beginning of a novel. And just within the first couple of sentences, it's, so propulsive, and there's this incredibly striking image. Can you talk a little bit about, not only where how you decided to start here, but where the sort of impetus for the book came from for you?
Thank you. I love the word propulsive. As I've mentioned in a couple of interviews, the original idea of the story of the boy in the field came from a school friend whom I hadn't seen in certainly over 30 years, maybe more. And we met in New York and talked about our lives over lunch. And he described something I had never known, which was how he had come home from school one summer afternoon, and at the bottom of his garden, he lived in a very small village where there was absolutely no crime. In the bottom of his garden, he found the body of a young woman who'd been murdered by her boyfriend. And he fled instantly to call for help. But those few seconds changed his life. He felt his life swerved in a completely different direction, both in practical terms and in more psychological terms. And I was really struck by that story. And I was in the midst of another book, so I didn't immediately turn around and do something, but I kept thinking about it, and also thinking about the idea that so many detective stories begin with finding a body, and very often it is the body of a young woman, often a beautiful young woman. And I thought, I really don't want to do that. I don't want to write that kind of story. But I do want to write about some teenagers seeing something that is very traumatic. So I decided to make the person that Matthew, Zoe, and Duncan find a young man, just a little older than them, and to make his wounds not fatal. He does recover. So it's sort of like the opening of a detective story, but also not really. And it was, I think, you know, I have a good friend, a wonderful writer, Susan Bryson, who's written a book about trauma called Aftermath. And I just learned so much reading her book about the different responses to trauma and how yeah, one's life takes a sudden turn. And I also think that age, you know, 17, 15, and 13, I mean, I think it's an extremely intense time of life. So I really love the idea of writing about younger characters.
Yeah. And I think, you know, that's another thing I wanted to sort of ask you about is, so we move between the points of view of these three teenage protagonists. What was that like for you? What was the process of sort of getting to know these characters, getting to know them as individuals and as siblings? And I guess, did it help to have them all united by this shared experience at the beginning?
I think it definitely helped to have them all in the presence of the boy at the beginning. And one of the things that happens is he says one word while he's lying in the field, and they each of them hear the word differently, but they don't realize they've heard it differently. And that was a little sort of signpost into the novel and the different ways they experience even seemingly shared experiences. And I think, I mean, I find this very much in your novel, that we see people in a family cohabiting, living under the same roof, and yet their ideas of what's happened, even just round the dinner table, it can be vastly different. So getting to know Matthew, Zoe, and Duncan was a lot like getting to know people, a lot like getting to know adult characters. There were some things I was very struck by while I was, you know, I made a point of interviewing, that sounds too formal, talking to teenagers whenever I could find them. And I was really struck by their, for the most part, their very strong moral sense, their strong ethical sense, and they weren't up for compromise. They had ideas of what was right and wrong and what was true and false. And that was one of the things I played with, particularly in Zoe's character. And I decided that their response to finding the boy in the field would be that each of them would go on a separate quest, if you like. Matthew, the oldest, would become a sort of detective figure, although there is a proper detective in the novel. Zoe goes looking for someone who will see her not as a daughter or a sister, but as herself. You might say she's looking for romantic love, looking for someone to recognize her. And Duncan, the youngest, who's adopted, but has never given much thought to being adopted, suddenly feels like he really needs to find his mother.
How are you? I'm well.
And
yeah.
I can.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
And anyway, so those three quests, the quest that each of the three teenagers was on, was also my way of getting to know them, of putting them in different situations and seeing what they did. And I didn't think, as I was writing, about alternating their points of view in some in some rhythm, in some rote way. I just kept thinking, what does the larger story need next? And who should be telling the next part of the larger story? And then in revision, of course, there was a process of negotiation as I tried to make sure that there was something like balance between them.
Mm. And did you write this novel in order, or did you sort of spend, days with Zoe and kind of like, how did that unfold for you?
I did write it very much in order, although I had a massive detour, like one of those times you get massively lost in a car and you think you're going to New Hampshire and you end up in New Jersey. It was sort of like that. I wrote an extended passage about Carol, the boy in the field, works in a local hospital, and I wrote a number of scenes set there before I decided they were really too distracting, and that they weren't they weren't doing quite what I hoped they would do. And there were a number of other things like that, but for the most part, I just I did write it more or less in the order the reader experiences.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna look at my questions. So this book takes place in the months before, do we call it Y2K, before the advent of the year 2000, which, we were afraid of for a variety of reasons, none of which ended up being, there were far larger and scarier things, but it also, it takes place pre 9/11, and certainly pre, the times that we're living in now and have been for the last, 5 or 6 years or 20 years or however you want to look at it. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to set the novel in this period of time? And I also am just curious what that experience, like what it was like writing about this, comparatively innocent time during, presumably some, things that have happened in recent past. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking today about your novel, because as far as I remember, it's set mostly in 2016.
It is, yeah.
But then we go back, I think, almost 40 years at some points. I mean, we get the whole span of the Sorensens' marriage. Anyway, so you were writing much closer to the present. In some places.
I think I got away I sort of, this was either laziness or fear or, creative strategy, but I think I avoided, so I kept the novel so closely within the walls of their house that I didn't really have to confront what was going on, outside their front door, which was convenient and sort of a nice cocoon for me to return to as I was working on it. So I wonder if you had the same experience.
Well, I think I decided to go back to 1999, both because of that sense of menace or danger that we didn't quite know how to identify, but also because for the very pragmatic reason that I didn't want my 3 protagonists to have mobile phones.
Yeah, I wondered.
Both because it would have changed the plot, but I think also at another level, I needed each of them to have a certain autonomy. And I feel that teenagers now have less autonomy because of their mobile phones. There's more having to account hour by hour, sometimes minute by minute, to their parents. And I really wanted Matthew, Zoe, and Duncan to have the freedom to go on their quests and do what they needed to do. But I also found it surprisingly complicated writing about 1999, because when I went to do research, for instance, I went to the police station in Oxford, and the police told me, oh yes, we remodeled in 2005. So I said, well, could you tell me what it was like before you remodeled? And there were 3 policemen on duty. They had all been there before the remodeling, but none of them could remember anything about it. And I found the same thing in a number of places when I tried to rely on people's memories, that actually people don't remember things very clearly. You know, or if they do remember them, they don't remember if it changed in 2001 or 2007, or you know. So in some cases, I just had to kind of make a leap into 1999 and hope that I was getting things mostly right.
Yeah, yeah. It feels right to me. It was also just such a pleasure reading it. Like there's an innocence about the time. And I think part of it is the age of the protagonists too, and that they're all sort of on the precipice of something, or, you know, figuring out what it means to be a person in the world autonomously, like you said. But I'm feeling very nostalgic about everything lately. And I think, you know, there's something really lovely about inhabiting this space that feels, despite the fact that we find a body at the beginning of the novel, it feels safer in some ways than the world feels contemporarily. So yeah, I was just curious about that.
Yeah.
So as a surprise to no one, my favorite character in this novel is not a human character. There's a dog named Lily who I think looks, at least in my, you know, sort of reading, resembles my dog quite a bit, who I'm going to pull over momentarily if she won't come herself. But I wondered if you could, I was hoping you would read a little bit about the moment when we meet Lily in the novel, and then I'll have some follow-up questions about her.
Renee will make a guest appearance if I read nicely.
We will lure her over.
A few months before the novel begins, the family dog, Arthur, a beloved Dachshund, died. And they all miss him, but Duncan, the youngest, particularly misses Arthur. And he persuades his father to take him to an animal rescue. But the animal rescue is just daunting because there are so many dogs Duncan would like to take home, and he can't bear the idea of taking one dog and leaving the others. So this is what happens. So he leaves the animal rescue empty-handed, but this is what happens just a few days later. Duncan was leaving the newsagent's, his new pencils paid for and in a bag, when he saw the card in the window, a drawing of a dog, black, with large eyes and large paws, nicely done by someone not particularly skilled. Good dog, free to good home. No phone number, but an address Duncan knew not far away. He wrote the house number on the palm of his hand. As he walked down first one street, then another, he tried not to be too hopeful. Who would get rid of a dog if it didn't have a problem? He wished he could put into words what he was looking for, not size or age or breed, apart from no more Dachshunds, but some kind of emanation. At the sight of the house, he checked his palm, hoping he'd got the number wrong. The front garden was thick with weeds. Moss grew between the bricks around the door. Remembering the drawing, Duncan pushed open the gate. The doorbell, when he pressed it, was dead. He knocked twice. He was bending to move a snail off the path when he heard the latch turn. Two slender feet, clad in black socks, occupied the threshold. "Hey," said a voice. A boy, a little older than Matthew, was regarding him with an open gaze. "Hey," said Duncan. He set the snail down among the weeds. "I saw your notice in the newsagent's about the good dog." Something changed in the boy's expression. Had the dog already gone? "I don't mean to be rude," he said, "but is this okay with your mum and dad? Not everyone likes dogs." "It's definitely okay," Duncan said. He explained about Arthur and the failed visit to the animal rescue. "Why don't you want your dog anymore?" "I'm going to London," the boy said. "I can't take care of Lily as well as myself. She needs company, regular walks." Lily, thought Duncan. The boy opened the door wide and led the way down a corridor. In the kitchen, a black dog, a little bigger than Arthur, was sitting on a tattered red rug, her front paws, not especially large, neatly together. Duncan knelt down a couple of yards away and held out his hand. Her coat was sleek, like that of a black Labrador, but her ears were pricked, like those of a corgi, only smaller. She studied him for a few seconds. Then she stood up and walked towards him, taking him in with her dark eyes. She was not a puppy, but still young. She sniffed his hand, sat down, and held up her right paw. The invitation was clear. Duncan felt the rough pads, the prick of nails. Lily emanated. "She likes you," said the boy, "and you seem to like her." "How old is she?" Duncan squeezed her paw gently and released it. "I don't know," the boy said. "She's an orphan. One night last Christmas I came home and she was curled up on the doorstep shivering. She was so small she'd squeezed under the garden gate. I brought her in and fed her, and in the morning I went up and down the street asking if anyone had lost a puppy. I put up notices. No one responded, so I decided she'd claimed me. Now she's claiming you."
That's one of my favorite sections of your book. Thank you for reading that. I'm gonna, come here, hey. She's gonna be, this is Renee, who is visiting. Can you talk about having, like, where did you, why did you want to put a dog in the novel? And this is a dog who's not an ordinary dog. This is a dog who, as you said, emanates. Lily has, not magical powers, but Lily is not your average dog. Can you talk a little bit about her?
Well, one thing I'm quite struck by is how can you introduce a new member into a family? How can you change the dynamic of a family, short of introducing a guest or another person? And a pet, a so-called pet is a rather demeaning word, but a dog or a cat seemed a wonderful possibility for changing in some ways the family dynamics and for giving Duncan a companion and a guide through this difficult time as he thinks about how he can find his birth mother. But the idea really started quite a number of years ago when I visited the Dalton School, a wonderful private school in New York. And I met with a class of 10-year-olds who read a couple of my stories. And when I asked them whether they had questions for me about the stories, one girl raised her hand and said, yeah, the thing she found really puzzling about my stories was that the animals didn't talk. And I thought it was such a great question because, of course, in children's books, animals are chatting a mile a minute. It's quite rare to have a children's book where if there's an animal, the animal doesn't talk. So I asked the class, the pupils, about their stories. They all wrote stories, and they all said to a girl and boy, of course our animals talk. Why would we have an animal in our story if it didn't talk? And I thought about that and the kind of complicated reasons why there's a certain point when animals shut up. They stop getting to talk. And I thought, well, what could I do something a little bit different? Could I try to kind of hang on to this idea? And Lily does not actually talk, but she does convey her opinions quite clearly on a number of crucial occasions and has strong thoughts and feelings that are experienced by different members in the family, especially Duncan. Mm-hmm. And I became just devoted to her and counted on her to rescue certain situations.
Yeah, she seems to appear at the precisely right moment a number of different times. And she really is sort of I hadn't thought about, like you said, introducing a new family member and shifting that dynamic even further, but she is kind of this unifying force for a family that is they're all sort of their own little satellites at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, the family is it's not at loggerheads, but people are moving in different directions.
Yeah.
The three teenagers are on their own quests. The father has his own preoccupations. The mother has her preoccupations. Everyone's a bit scattered. And Lily becomes a kind of central force in the household.
Yeah, yeah. No, she's terrific. She's a really good example of like a good functional dog in fiction. I always like when they play important roles. I like when they're there regardless, but Lily does a lot of work for this novel.
Yeah,
Um,
I think so too. And I of course I partly stole the idea also from William Trevor, who has a wonderful dog in his short novel So Long, See You Tomorrow.
oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. That's an okay thing to steal.
I
Um, let's see, what else do I want to ask you about? This is sort of a general question. We talked about this a little bit on the phone earlier. I'm curious about how you name your characters. This is sort of a broad question, but I'm, specifically talking about this book. But how do you find names for your characters typically? Do they come to you? Do they,
do they come to me? They do come to me sometimes, unfortunately.
Okay.
One character in the novel is inadvertently named after one of my father's colleagues, someone I hadn't seen in at least 50 years, but somehow his name had stayed in my mind and I didn't even notice I'd used it. So maybe that's not an ideal example, but I try to, I suppose I think about the parents. What names would they choose?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's quite I think parents often spend quite a lot of time discussing the names. They have arguments about the names. They go back and forth. So my first task was really naming the parents, Betsy and Hal.
Yeah.
And once I'd named them, then I kept thinking, well, what names would they choose and that would resonate for them? And I wanted names that weren't, again, I'm thinking of your wonderful novel. You have Wendy and Violet, is that right?
Yeah, yeah. Sort of not the most common names. Yeah. Slightly left of center names. Yeah.
So you have names that are familiar but not exactly common. And I think I was looking for the same thing. I think Matthew is a fairly common name. Zoe and Duncan, perhaps a bit less so.
Slightly less so. Yeah. Duncan was an interesting one too. And then Duncan sort of has the question of what would his birth mother have named, and just the ways that could have impacted his identity. I think it's an interesting question, but instead he's, his adoptive parents have given him this, specific name that he embodies very well. I think I've never met a Duncan, I don't think, but thought it suited him.
In an earlier novel, The House on Fortune Street, I had a character named Gilbert. At some sort of marketing meeting, people protested that Gilbert didn't sound sufficiently masculine. And I asked my editor if she could give me some hints as to how he could sound more masculine. And she said, well, his name is a problem, and he cooks, and he doesn't drive, and he likes poetry. And I thought this was wonderful. So he's actually doing a PhD in poetry. So I thought, well, I'm stuck with that.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, in the version of The House on Fortune Street that was finally published, Gilbert became Sean, and he buys takeaways, and he can drive.
Okay.
So
you met them halfway, yeah.
But it was really hard to change a name that late in the novel.
I imagine, yeah. Do you still does he still exist as Gilbert in your mind? Or?
Well, I noticed I wrote a short story few years ago, and I immediately decided the character would be called Gilbert because I still felt he hadn't really had his due as Gilbert.
Yeah. He needed his moment. Let's see. Well, something you said that you wanted to talk about, and I'm curious about with this book. So this book has actually a fair amount of plot, like just forward-moving plot, but there's also a lot of emotional substance. You have these three, main characters, each on their own sort of quest. There's a lot happening, but it's a relatively short, compact novel. Did you always know this was going to be a shorter book? Did you have a, page limit in mind, or how did that unfold?
I really did have a page limit in mind, or more accurately, I had a word count in mind.
Okay.
And I had long admired a number of short novels, Willa Cather's My Mortal Enemy, Penelope Fitzgerald's The Coming of Spring, James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, were three novels that I just think are endlessly gorgeous, but they're quite short. And I wanted to try to follow in their footsteps, perhaps particularly Penelope Fitzgerald, who has a great deal of plot in The Coming of Spring, and yet it remains a short and elegant novel. And I thought, what would that do to my aesthetic, and what might it enable me to accomplish? So it was a kind of aesthetic decision from the beginning. What about in The Most Fun We Ever Had?
Which is not a compact novel. I don't know. I was thinking about that. My book sort of just kept growing and growing and growing, and at the outset, I didn't have a present story in the novel, so I was just sort of like, I just want to sit in someone's house for 40 years and, watch what happens. But I was thinking about, I'm like 98% positive that you were the one who said this in a seminar once. You were talking about families in fiction and how there are tidy families and messy families. And I feel like in the case of The Most Fun We Ever Had, the Sorensen family is a fairly messy family. There's a lot of, a lot going on, and a lot of sort of deep-seated animosity in amongst love and other things. But the core family and The Boy in the Field feels a little bit tidier. They seem to be more willing to express their affection. They seem to be more forthcoming with each other about some things, not about all things. But I was thinking about sort of how much space drama can take up. And so I was wondering if there was something in there that you do have in The Boy in the Field. You have the three siblings, each sort of on their own quiet quest. But the family at the core feels very tender and very sort of, that they love each other, and that these kids, have a great deal of affection for their siblings, despite the fact that they're all teenagers, and for their parents as well. So I was wondering I was just thinking about the sort of messy families versus tidy families.
The Langs, that's their surname, Lang.
Mm-hmm.
They are, a functional family. Even though there are strains and stresses, the family is basically resilient, and they are able to change. They are able to accommodate change without breaking apart. And I think that was something I really wanted to show in a novel. A number of my novels have been, fairly dark, or quite difficult things have happened. And in this case, I don't want to give away the plot, but I did want there to be a kind of higher level of harmony than has been possible in some of my other narratives. And at the same time, to have quite a dramatic plot with quite a lot of suspenseful moments and things I hope the reader would be waiting to discover.
Absolutely, yeah. Which is another reason that it's so impressive that this book is so short. Not short. I don't mean that that sounds pejorative. But that there is, this mystery that we're following throughout the entire book. We sort of get, it's very easy to sort of get lost in I felt a lot of affection for Zoe, and I felt very protective of her and liked sort of following her to Oxford on her, her own quest. But while these things are unfolding, there is this, almost thriller-esque plot happening in the background. So there's a really lovely sort of, the balance of those two things is really interesting, and not something I've really seen before. So it's, just, it's a great book. Yeah. How are we doing on time? Okay. I think we're decent. I'm not sure when we started, but it is now 8. So something else you had mentioned earlier. So the book you published before this was not a novel, it's a collection of craft essays. And so you have sort of, as you said yourself, kind of written this novel with yourself over your shoulder, with sort of maybe your own voice in your head about, how to write fiction or how to craft a novel. What was that like? Was it crippling? Was it inspiring?
It was both, I would have to say. I mean, I did write The Hidden Machinery. I wanted the book to feel companionable. I didn't want it to be lecturing or cross or saying you must do this or that, because I think there are so many ways wonderful books can get written. But at the same time, I was urging certain things like characters with attitude, characters who walk off the page. I was suggesting the possibility of scenes and why you might want to show some things and tell others, how the two could accompany each other. The importance of having subplots, all of these are things I talk about in The Hidden Machinery. And then, I'm writing away and I'm thinking, oh, does Zoe have attitude? Does she have enough attitude? How are people imagining her? Am I doing enough to make the reader want to fill in the character, as I think we do with the characters we love best in fiction?
Mm-hmm.
So it was at times a little bit intimidating. There's one essay called Writing, is it called Writing? Is it Writing the Life, Writing the Novel, something like that, about how E.M. Forster wrote A Passage to India and Henry James wrote Portrait of a Lady. And both of those novels came onto the page very unevenly. I mean, I think they end up being great novels, but they're not exactly good role models. So
Sure.
that was intimidating as well in some ways.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah. It's, I found, being a student or, when I'm teaching and writing at the same time, I'll hear myself saying something that, you need to do this. And then I sort of fall down the hole of like, wait, but do I do that? Or is it, and then you can find, examples of incredible novels that didn't or did do that thing and still worked. So it's not an exact science, I guess, but it's, interesting. Okay. I see. Is Mary back? Is that?
I'm back.
Yeah. Do you
I don't know if you're ready for me, but I'm back.
Sure. Yes. Welcome. Do you have questions for?
I always have questions. Wayne will tell you, I always have questions. So as I was following the conversation, this concept of a messy family versus maybe a cleaner or not as dramatic family. So I'm thinking about, once again, going back to my earlier question, when you've got several protagonists, is that a conscious decision? Like, I want this family to be a messy family, or I want this story to be very dramatic in that way, or by virtue of having multiple protagonists, it becomes that way? Or I guess probably for me, one of the biggest questions I have in terms of writing is how much of it is truly conscious on the part of the author and how much of it is being taken away with the story. And maybe it varies from author to author. Maybe it's consistent. Can you guys speak to that a little bit? Because you both have beautiful books and multiple protagonists, sort of, and I just wonder, is it conscious? Like, I'm gonna sit back and write this kind of book, or
Hmm.
I'm looking at Claire.
Oh. I mean, I have like a cop-out answer, I guess, which is it was not planned for me, I don't think. But I think as I wrote, my novel started in one point of view. And then as I was writing that, I became more and more sort of interested in the people surrounding that point of view. And I wanted kind of the ease. It's partially just that I'm nosy. I wanted to be able to, look at a conversation and then, drive home with one of the people and talk about what had happened. I'm sort of voyeuristic by nature. So I think for me, the most fun we ever had kind of kept growing in that way. Partially because I was greedy and I sort of wanted to just understand the different points of view of everyone in this family. So I don't think I set out to do it.
Which point of view did you start out with?
Violet, which is strange because it's the character I ended up feeling the least attached to. But she is sort of the impetus for plot in the novel. But yeah, I don't know. I didn't set out to do it. Did you, Margot?
I was just hoping you'd keep talking so I could gather my thoughts. Well, I was trying to, and this may not make much sense, but I was aiming for a certain kind of tone in my novel. So it is a realistic novel, and it's rooted in a time and a place, but it also hovers just slightly above that time and place. I was trying to write a novel that would be both simple and complicated, if that makes sense. So I did have certain ambitions, and knowing that I was going to have only a small number of pages, I wasn't going, for instance, to introduce cousins or grandparents or everything in the novel is sort of serving a purpose and moving forward, I hope.
So to that end, sort of serving a purpose and moving forward, again, is that really conscious, or is that just the characters went in this direction and I followed, or I wanted to go in this direction and so I brought the characters along with me in that direction? I'm sure there's no right or wrong. I'm always just really curious, how does that work? So.
Well, I wrote just an atrociously bad novel in my early 20s, and one of the many, many things that was bad about it was that I had no idea what the ending was going to be until pretty much the end, when I was suddenly like, oh my God. And it was a very incoherent experience to read that novel. So I have tried since then to make sure I have a destination where the novel is heading. It may not be completely clear and I may change it, but I am going somewhere.
Yeah.
And that has been very helpful to me. But what about you, Claire?
I mean, I do think constraints are of help to me, and we've talked about this in workshops and stuff. I mean, I do think in the most fun we ever had, I knew the book needed to end eventually, and I didn't know where or how it would end for a long time. But once I did, other things sort of fell into place. Or I think the sort of having some idea of where you're going to end up is helpful. But that said, I guess I'm working on something now and I have no idea where it's going. So maybe that's a sign of doom. I don't know.
So if I recall correctly, Claire, when you are working, I think the last time I saw you on video, you gave us a brief glimpse of your next project, and you were outlining with sticky notes in different colors. And so you outline. Margot, do you outline?
No, I outline retrospectively. So I look over my shoulder and make an outline of what I've done. And that helps me.
It does. It helps you stay on a certain path.
Exactly. Yes. Seeing what my characters are doing. Yes.
And so I once did an event for a gentleman who, an author, and when he wrote a book, particularly with his protagonist, but even some ancillary characters, he would, the book in question was written in the 40s, and he went to a thrift shop. He found a dress that he anticipated his character would wear. It was hanging on the wall in the room where he wrote. He had notes on the music the character might listen to and all these different pieces. And I was blown away. I mean, number one, I was like, wow, how amazing to, from my perspective, so much of that is a part of one's imagination, the ability to write and create a story. And so I thought he really was taking all of those pieces of his imagination and creating them into something, you know, really tangible. But to him, it really helped him stay in the nature of his characters and what they were all about and what they were like. So do you guys, either of you, do anything similar related to your characters?
Margot?
I did spend quite a bit of time looking at newspapers and magazines from 1999 and films that had come out that year, and then really put everything aside. But it was very helpful just to be reminded of what would have been going on in the background, even though I didn't use it. When I wrote something that was more historical, a novel called Eva Moves the Furniture, I did work, you know, very hard to figure out all kinds of things about what people wore and ate and what you could have got in a restaurant and what would be a good night out. And so I really can understand hanging a dress on the wall.
Totally.
How about you, Claire?
I don't think I did some sort of research, for the most fun we ever had, just to sort of get certain period details right. But the thing I'm doing now, the book I'm working on largely takes place in the 90s. And I don't listen to music when I'm writing, but when I'm walking the dog, which is pretty much the only thing I ever do besides writing lately, I've been listening to a lot of music just from that era and just sort of getting into, lots of like 90s alt rock, just to sort of, I don't know, it's been helping me, I think, sort of get into the, not headspace, but just sort of the milieu of that time. But yeah, I very much understand, having something to look to. One thing I was also thinking about, the novelist Alan Gurganis, who came to teach at Iowa very briefly when I was there. I was having trouble with, because there are multiple points of view in the novel and multiple voices, many of whom were young females like me. He said, we have a problem, which is that all of these voices sound exactly the same and they all sound exactly like you. So he told me to more sticky notes, but just put a Post-it above my computer that said, Liza, and then 4 different adjectives that would describe her. It was a very basic exercise that really helped me, because I was able to, just sort of think, that person wouldn't phrase this that way, or she would use a bigger word, or she would be more, brash, or so that's, another something I was thinking about. Yeah.
Interesting.
Maybe I could steal this opportunity, because Alan Gurganis was a very good friend of Randall Keenan's, and Randall Keenan was a wonderful writer whom I had the good fortune to teach with at the Sewanee Writers Conference for more than 20 years. And his latest collection, If I Had Two Wings, came out in early August, and very sadly Randall died a few weeks later. So I just wanted to shout out for his book and say, if you have a chance to read it, it's a really beautiful book by a radiant writer. And everybody who knows him has the deep pleasure of finding his voice in these pages, but his voice is also there for people who never met him. And I just wanted to commend his book to you, all of you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. So I don't know, ladies, are you talked out? Shall I give you another question?
I think this is maybe quite a good moment to end, Mary. I mean, not
okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's been a wonderful chat. I've really appreciated it. And thank you for tolerating me with my questions about structure and imagination and how that all works. And is it the same for each of you? And those are the pieces that have always intrigued me about writing. Yeah. And how one can take it from their brain and their imagination and put it on a piece of paper and then have it be something spellbinding for all of us to read. So I appreciate that. So I'm going to take this moment to say thank you so much to Claire Lombardo, author of The Beautiful Most Fun We Have Ever Had, and to Margot Livesey, author of The Boy in the Field, and remind you all to purchase them either at your own local independent bookstore, or if you don't have one close by, please feel free to go to madstreetbooks.com and get them from us online. We're happy to ship anywhere in the United States. And I would just ask you all to stay tuned. We have more virtual events, Mad Street Madness virtual events happening in the next 2 weeks. We'll be posting about them on social media, and they're already posted on our website. So thank you, Margot. Thank you, Claire. We really appreciate you guys being here with us this evening.
Oh, thank you very much, Mary. And your questions are fabulous. I could answer questions of that kind all night long.
I always feel like maybe I'm prying a bit, but it's fascinating to me. And, you know, I wish that I had that gift. And I really think that I so appreciate those around me that do. So thank you.
And many thanks to you, Claire, and to Madison Street Books for your hospitality, and Claire, your generosity in reading my work so thoughtfully and reminding me of the pleasures of Violet and Wendy and the Sorensens.
Thank you, Margot. This has been such a pleasure. It's really an honor. And I loved the book so much, and I'm so happy to see you, even though we cannot be in Iowa City together right now. So thank you for taking the time.
And special pats for Renee for participating so graciously and
here she
adding her luster to the event.
Yeah, she's emanating into our
Oh, she does look a lot like I imagined Lily. So.
She's adorable.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Mad Street, for having us. And thank you, Margaret.
Pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you, Wayne and Bess and Mary.
Yeah. We look forward to the opportunity to host you ladies again, because that will mean that you will have been prolific and there are that many more wonderful novels for us to read and that many more opportunities to host you. So thank you.
We'll get back to our desks immediately.
Perfect. Perfect. Good night, all.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.